In this video, we'll go over the best cards in the game which have a life point cost. One of the easiest costs you can pay in the game, which is actually attached to a whole bunch of very powerful cards. And at number 10, we have Instant Fusion. This card simply has the effect that you can pay 1000 life points to special any level 5 or lower fusion monster from your extra deck, with the restriction that it cannot attack and will be destroyed during the end phase. It's also a hard once per turn, and because it also has this hard once per turn, it kind of avoided the ban list for a majority of its lifetime, despite the fact that it does treat the fusion monster as if it was properly fusion summoned, which is something that rarely happens with cards that cheat monsters out of the extra deck. And here's the thing about special summoning monsters: being able to bring them out of the extra deck is the best place to bring them from. And over the years, Instant Fusion had a couple of really good targets, including Norden, who was basically on the ban list because of Instant Fusion. And even then, after they banned Norden, Instant Fusion was just so good in so many decks because of the wide range of good level 5 or lower fusion monsters that it finally got hit on the ban list and is limited to 1 within the past couple of years. Which kinda surprised no one, because it was a wonder it had lasted so long in the first place, as it could be used to bring out stuff like Thousand Eyes Restrict to steal one of your opponent's monsters and just use it for link plays. It's heavily used in Thunder Dragon decks to bring out Kaminari attacks that can go into Thunder Dragon Titan, and it was even used in Orcus decks to bring out El Shaddol Window, in order to lock your opponent out of special summoning more than one monster, as they would just protect it with Dingirsu for a turn, and then let it die during their opponent's end phase so they could special summon without any restrictions during their turn. There's just so many ways to use it. You basically have to trade one card in your hand and 1000 life points to get a special summon of a monster, which was restricted during Master Rule 4, but was made a lot stronger after they loosened the restrictions with the revisions, and is definitely why they finally put the card to 1. And at number 9, we have Destrudo, the Lost Dragon's Frism. This card actually saw a ton of play and was a staple during the days of Master Rule 4, before they put the revisions in and released Crystron Halquiferbrax. As soon as those two things happened, this card got banned because of its potential to be kinda broken in the new format. As you see, what it does is it's a level 7 tuner monster which can special summon itself from your hand or graveyard by paying half your life points, and targeting a level 6 or lower monster you control, in which case this card's level will be reduced by the level of the targeted monster. So basically, Destrudo would allow you to have the materials to go into a level 7 synchro monster as long as you got this card into your graveyard or your hand. And since it was either of those two things, that made it really good, as there are a lot of cards that can get dragons into the graveyard pretty quickly. Although it does have the restriction where it is returned to your deck if it's removed from the field after using its special summon effect. You can't use it every turn too easily. So with Destrudo, decks had pretty easy access to Ancient Fairy Dragon before that got banned, and FA Dawn Dragster afterwards, since that gave them an easy negate for spell and trap cards. Although, with the combo potential with Crystron Halquiferbrax, a card that's already super strong and has caused a handful of other cards hit the ban list, it kinda makes sense why they got rid of Destrudo, since it would allow an easy material to bring out Halquiferbrax in order to start up the combos, especially with how prevalent synchro monsters have been since the Master Rule revisions. If anything, expect more synchro monsters and tuners to be put on the ban list in the future. And at number 8, we have Return from the Different Dimension. This is a trap card which requires you to pay half your life points in order to special summon as many of your banished monsters as possible. But during the end phase, you have to banish all the monsters you special summon with this effect. Now, in the early days of the game, when this card first came out, it didn't see very much play, because there weren't a lot of decks that actually banished their monsters for stuff, who also wanted to pay half your life points in order to bring them back for a turn, and use them in some meaningful way outside of just attacking with them. It wasn't really until Synchro and Xyz monsters came out that it started to become much more of a problem, because if you could actually use those monsters for extra deck plays, then you didn't have to worry about the side effects where they all were banished during the end phase. In which case the card basically became a +4 in card advantage, where you just get 5 cards out as long as you set up your banish zone, and a lot more cards being released kind of use the banish zone as a second graveyard anyway, especially modern decks like Orcus or Thunder Dragons, which would probably benefit the most from a card like this. If anything, the reason the card went unbanned for so long, despite the fact that it gave such a huge advantage, is because it was a trap card that had to be set a turn before it could be used, which usually does a good job of balancing a broken card. But like I said, more banished focus archetypes who came out would definitely be willing to wait a turn to use this card, and it could basically win them the game if it resolved, which made it a little bit too strong, especially since the life point cost is kinda irrelevant. There's a reason cards like Solemn Judgment see play in all kinds of decks, despite the fact that it requires you to trade 1-for-1 essentially by just paying half your life points. You only need 1 life point in order to win. Other than that, it's a resource you can use in order to further your plays. And cards which only require you to pay your life points in order to gain great effects, like all of the Solemn cards, are actually super good, because you don't really lose much advantage using them like you would a card that requires you to discard, like Ultimate Providence. And at number 7, we have Premature Burial. This one's life point cost actually did kind of come into play, but only because it was so easy to use this card's effect so many times. You see, this card has the effect where you can pay 800 life points to special summon 1 monster from your graveyard. And since this is one of the earlier versions of cards that did something like this, its only downside was that if the card is destroyed, then you destroy the equipped monster, instead of the card leaving the field, like with the Retrain, Different Dimension Reincarnation. Since it didn't actually destroy the monster, if you simply bounce the card back to your hand, you could use the effect in order to special summon another monster from your graveyard for the low cost of 800 life points. And with how easy it is to search out equipped cards, since they're kinda some of the worst cards in the game, it was an excellent combo that definitely got the card banned, as it didn't require you to pay enough life points for the advantage it granted, especially in today's current metagame where special summoning from the graveyard is more valuable than ever, where its Retrain DDR actually sees a whole bunch of competitive play, because people are able to loop that effect.
This is painful. I don't like when other people are here.
DDR requires you to discard 1 card to use it, which is a much steeper cost than having to pay life points. It only targets a monster in your banish zone and not the graveyard, and if the card leaves the field, it destroys the equipped monster. And even with all of these restrictions, it's a central card played in a warrior loop strategy that allows you to gain a whole bunch of advantage. They did also make another retrain called Overdone Burial, which does again try to balance the effect, where it has even stricter restrictions. You have to discard a monster from your hand that has a higher level than the monster you want to special summon from the graveyard, and then the monster you bring out has its effect negated. And there's even a hard once per turn on using this effect, so it's not even possible to loop it in the same turn. Although, since it has that hard once per turn, it doesn't actually have an effect which destroys the monster it's equipped to if it leaves the field. And since the worst retrain versions see play, that should go a long way to show why the original one would be way too powerful to be released from the ban list. And yet the rest of this list is stacked with even more broken cards, as this one only makes it the spot at number 7. And at number 6, we have Confiscation. This is a spell card that simply requires you to pay 1000 life points to look at your opponent's hand, then select and discard any 1 card from it. Now this effect actually seems pretty tame if you're new to the game or haven't played in a long time, because it's essentially a 1-for-1. You lose 1 card from your hand to get rid of 1 card from your opponent's hand, and you have to pay life points to do it. However, there is another card in the game called Appointer of the Red Lotus, which is a trap card that requires you to pay 2000 life points to look at your opponent's hand, and then it will only allow you to remove from play 1 card from their hand until the end of the turn. And Appointer of the Red Lotus sees a whole bunch of competitive play because that effect is so good, and you have to wait a turn before using that card. Confiscation actually gets rid of the card and can be used as soon as you draw it, and has an even lower life point cost. And the reason this is so good is because it gives you information on your opponent's hand and allows you to get rid of 1 card from it, which means you can see if your opponent has any hand traps that would hinder you from going into your combos. If you see they don't have any hand traps, you can just get rid of one of their key combo pieces that they might need on their next turn, and then do your combos like normal. If they do have hand traps, you can get rid of one of the problem ones and then play around your opponent's other ones. Because the modern metagame is so reliant on hand traps, being able to get information on your opponent's hand is super valuable, and being able to do that immediately on your first turn while getting rid of one of them is kind of broken. That's why the card 3 Tactical Talent sees so much play. That card can only be activated if your opponent uses a monster effect during your turn, and then it allows you to choose 1 of 3 effects. The most commonly chosen one is the one that lets you look at your opponent's hand and return 1 card back from it, because it's definitely the strongest of the 3. However, little caveats, Confiscation is only really good in meta decks against other meta decks. If you're playing a much lower tier of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where combos and hand traps aren't really a big deal, it's honestly not that broken. Because if your opponent doesn't play hand traps, then you don't have to worry about hand traps. And if they're playing a mishmash of okayish cards, then you can't really pick one card which would disrupt all their combos. And at number 5, we have Dimension Fusion. This is a spell card similar to Return from the Different Dimension, except better since you can use it during your turn, where you pay 2,000 life points and then both players can special summon as many of their remove from play monsters as possible. The monsters special summon with this effect are not destroyed during the end phase or anything, and this card can be searched out with cards that can search out fusion spell cards, like Predaplant Darling Tonia Cobra. And there was this combo deck back in the day which kind of got this card banned way before Return from the Different Dimension, involving Dark Magician of Chaos and Spell Economics. Spell Economics simply allows you to not pay life points in order to activate spell cards, so you could ignore the 2,000 life point cost for Dimension Fusion, and Dark Magician of Chaos allowed you to add a spell card from your graveyard to your hand immediately after it was summoned, and it would banish itself when it left the field. You could kind of infinitely recycle Dark Magician of Chaos with Dimension Fusion, since it would just bring it back, and the Dark Magician of Chaos would just add Dimension Fusion back to your hand. Eventually, Dark Magician of Chaos got banned, and then it got unbanned after they errata its effect where it would only add a spell card during your end phase, instead of immediately after it was summoned, and they didn't do anything to Dimension Fusion, so it's still banned to this day. Because even though it lets your opponent special summon monsters too, you still get to do that during your turn, so you can kind of just get rid of all your opponent's monsters by attacking over them with the +4 in card advantage the card gives you. Even when they tried to release a more balanced version, like Soul Charge, they had to eventually ban the card because the ability to bring out so many cards at once is just too strong, especially when it doesn't have specific limitations like Rekindling. Because you see, Soul Charge is another very good card that makes you pay life points, although you lose them in a different way, so it doesn't really qualify for this list, where you can target any number of cards in your graveyard and special summon them, but you lose 1,000 life points for each monster summoned, and you also cannot conduct your battle phase during the turn. And it's a hard once per turn, so no looping worries. So it's actually possible to lose with the effect of Soul Charge since it doesn't make you pay life points in the traditional cost way. And even with this overly balanced version of Dimension Fusion, it was still so strong that it got banned eventually. So if they were to ever unban Dimension Fusion, they'd really have to give it a hard once per turn and restrict your battle phase or special summoning in some other way after the fact. And at number 4, we have Delinquent Duo. This card requires you to pay 1,000 life points in order to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand, one at random and one of their choice. Now, it doesn't actually let you look at your opponent's hand and pick the cards you want to discard, so in some cases it's not as good as Confiscation, since it doesn't give you knowledge of your opponent's hand. But it is a strict +1 in card advantage, as you trade 1 card in your hand for 2 cards from your opponent's hand. And being able to snipe cards from your opponent's hand is much better than sniping them on the field, graveyard, banish zone, or extra deck, because the hand is kind of where your cards are the safest. There's so few ways to actually get rid of cards in your opponent's hand, and the very few that do exist are considered pretty powerful, even if they don't do much, like a Pointer or the Red Lotus. So just having the easy availability of getting rid of 2 of them immediately can kind of win you the game if you just get lucky with those 2 discards. If you use Delinquent Duo on your first turn and just happen to get rid of both of your opponent's hand traps, or your opponent's only hand trap and their 1 combo starter, or just 2 other resources they needed in order to extend their plays, it's just really good advantage to have right out the gate with a very low cost of 1,000 life points. And funny enough, Delinquent Duo, Confiscation, and the Forceful Sentry were all in the game at the same time and contributed to one of the very first meta decks in the game, which did not require just beating over your opponent with very strong monsters. It was the first winning archetype which won by controlling your opponent's hand. Although sniping random cards in your opponent's hand is strong, it's really hard to gauge whether that's stronger than special summoning 5 monsters from your banish zone, or if it's even better than Confiscation. So the 4, 5, and 6 spots are all pretty flexible with each other. And at number 3, we have Ultimate Offering. This card allows you to pay 500 life points in order to normal summon 1 additional time. This effect is not once per turn and can be activated in your main phase or your opponent's battle phase, so it allows you to normal summon during your opponent's turn. And here's the thing about normal summoning in Yu-Gi-Oh! The fact that you can only normal summon 1 time is kind of how a lot of decks are balanced. They have 1 card which gains a whole bunch of advantage from its normal summon, and then everything else is special summoned in some other way. So being able to just remove that restriction and just normal summon all of your starters is kind of broken in the current metagame, without even talking about how a whole bunch of decks that could be created around this card to make it even more broken than it already is. There were even decks back in the day which could gain a whole bunch of advantage from this card before it got banned, like Gadgets or Madolches. But eventually, they realized having an unlimited amount of normal summons was too strong and it got banned. And kind of only stayed unbanned for as long as it did because it was a trap card, and you did have to wait a turn before doing all the ridiculous combos. As if you remember, that Brilliant Fusion is also banned because that card gives you one additional normal summon. That should show you a little something about how having a near infinite amount of normal summons would be. It kind of breaks the rules in the game in a way that they're very balanced around, and it only requires 500 life points per summon, which is kind of a crazy easy cost for how powerful the effect is. And at number 2, we have Royal Oppression. This card is actually kind of funny, because the card was obviously balanced in a way that indicates they knew the effect would be strong. So they gave it such a steep downside that there was no way it could be broken. Because this card has the effect where each player can pay 800 life points to negate the special summon of a monster, or an effect that would special summon a monster, and then destroy those cards. The effect is not once per turn, and can be used by both players, which was supposed to be the limiting factor. Sure, you had an unlimited amount of negates for your opponent's summons, but your opponent could also use it on your special summons as well. Here's the thing though, if you just played a deck that did not rely on special summons, you didn't have to worry about the side effects at all. Or if you just simply played cards that allow you to destroy Royal Oppression during your turn, you could just have it for your opponent's turn, negate everything they tried to do, and then just get rid of it as soon as your turn started. You see, the Solemn cards all have the effect that allow you to negate summons. Solemn Strike requires you to pay 1500 life points, and can only be used once per copy of the card. Solemn Warning requires 2000 life points, Solemn Judgment requires half your life points, and all three of those cards are great and see all kinds of play, despite the fact that so few people even play trap cards because they're too slow. The ability to negate your opponent's summons and effects is just so good that the Solemn cards are kind of some of the few exceptions to the rule of modern Yu-Gi-Oh players not using trap cards. Royal Oppression only requires you to pay 800 life points to do the same thing, and can be used as many times as you want, which is why I said its effect is kind of funny that it was built in a way to obviously offset its powerful effect, which just did not work at all. It was completely overpowered and eventually got banned. Then they tried again with Vanity's Emptiness, which was another card that messed with special summons and had built-in protection so that it wouldn't be broken. Except the card was also super good and used in kind of the same way as Royal Oppression. People would just play around its negatives, and it eventually got banned as well. And at number 1, we have Magical Scientist. This is a level 1 monster which simply has the effect where you can pay 1000 life points to special summon a level 6 or lower fusion monster from your extra deck. That fusion monster can attack and is returned to your extra deck during the end of the turn. And this effect is not once per turn. So the effect is basically like instant fusion. You know, the number 10 spot on this list, just without those silly restrictions, and allows you to target one level higher monsters, so it gives you a slightly larger amount of targets to choose from in your extra deck. So assuming you have the maximum life points of 8000, Magical Scientist allows you to summon up to 7 monsters during your turn before you run into the life point issue, and assuming you have the cards in your extra deck or a way to recycle them. And seeing just how powerful a hard once per turn instant fusion is, should show you something a little bit about how much advantage you could generate with Magical Scientists. Even back in the day when they didn't have extra deck monsters to use the advantage with, and only had fusion monsters, they could still use Magical Scientists in order to win in one turn, if it was simply comboed with the effect of Pre-Errata Catapult Turtle, where they would just summon a whole bunch of high attack level 6 monsters and then tribute them in order to inflict damage to your opponent before you lost all of your life points bringing them out. And it was one of the very first FTK decks in the game, which originally got Magical Scientists banned in the first place. And nowadays it would be 10 times stronger because, like I said, instant fusion exists, it's a severely limited version of Magical Scientists, and it sees so much play it's currently limited to 1. Especially since Magical Scientist has 3 really good monster distinctions going for it. It's Dark, a Spellcaster, and level 1. Being level 1 actually gives it some really good support, and you can even bring it out straight from your deck with 1-for-1. Being Dark means it benefits from all the Dark attribute support, which is the best attribute in the game with the most amount of support. And Spellcaster is one of the top 5 supported types of monsters, even more so for Dark Spellcaster specifically. If this card had a hard once per turn on it, it would still be good, The amount of advantage it generates right now definitely earns it a spot on the ban list. Although, when it comes to cards which can allow you to go +7 in card advantage, or negate all of your opponent's summons, or normal summon an unlimited amount of times, it's really hard to choose which one of these three is the most broken. So I kind of just went with the monster card one, which is a lot more playable than the two traps, even though all three of them are kind of equally bonkers. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other cards with a life point cost that are better than the ones I mentioned in the list? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one. And also, did you know, I started a new Dungeons & Dragons channel with a whole bunch of top 10 videos similar to the ones I do about Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you have a passing interest in that subject, you should definitely check it out. I'll have a link in the video description and at the end of the video right now. Now, an Omni Negate in Yu-Gi-Oh! Refers to a card that can negate the effect of basically any other card. So every card on this list has the ability to negate basically anything, assuming it's fast enough to respond to it anyway. But those are the criteria for this list, because generally, Omni Negates are super good because the ability to negate basically any card can win you the game if you do it to the correct target. And at number 10, we have Broken Line. This is a counter trap card which has the ability to negate the activation of a spell, trap, or monster effect and destroy that card, assuming it was activated in the same column as this card. And that's the only requirement, it just has to be in the same column. And ever since Link monsters force people to actually pay attention to columns, there is the chance you'll be able to actually use this. Here's the thing though, there is a very commonly played card called Infinite Impermanence, which also has column-based mechanics, although that one gains a bonus if a card is activated in the same column. So a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are conditioned to just not not play cards in the same column as set trap cards, if they can help it. So if your opponent just simply avoids the... In this video, we'll be going over the best monsters that have 2500 attack, an attack threshold for a lot of boss monsters actually. And at number 10, we have the Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon. This is a level 9 synchro monster of the Blue Eyes White Dragon archetype, and was kind of crucial to the success of Blue Eyes decks in the 2016 World Championship, where a Blue Eyes player actually won thanks to this card. Well, also, and a little bit, Dragon Spirit of White, another 2500 attack monster, which is very fitting for this list. You see, this synchro monster has 3 effects. One of them is a passive lockdown, where neither player can special summon 2 or more monsters at the same time. It can, once per turn, negate the effect of a card in the graveyard, and it can tag out into another Dragon Light type synchro monster from the extra deck, like Azure Eyes Silver Dragon, who himself is a level 9 synchro monster that can special summon normal monsters from the graveyard during the standby phase. And the card itself is easy to bring out, it just requires a tuner and a non-tuner Blue Eyes monster. And most of the Blue Eyes specific tuners are level 1, with nearly all of the Blue Eyes monsters being level 8. So it wasn't a difficult synchro monster to bring out in Blue Eyes decks at all. And it had a little bit of things going well for it. Pendulum decks were kind of in full swing at this time, so its first effect completely shut down Pendulum decks from being able to do their thing. And a lot of people were running Phantom Knights at the World Tournament, which is a deck that's all about graveyard effects. So this card single-handedly countered about half of the decks in the event. And funny thing is, the Blue Eyes decks were so good at countering the meta in that specific time period for that event, that the final match was actually a Blue Eyes mirror match. Both the first and second place of the World Tournament were Blue Eyes decks, something that hasn't really happened since Blue Eyes decks are generally not super good in the current meta. They kind of go by another name in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, known as Brick Eyes, because it plays so many high-level monsters, so it's really easy to get an unusable hand. Even so, a card that almost single-handedly allowed the Blue Eyes decks to win a World Tournament should definitely make it on this list, but only at the number 10 spot. And at number 9, we have Invoked Makaba. This is a light fusion monster of the Invoked engine, a deck that has fusion monsters for all the attributes, and their little gimmick is they can use your opponent's monsters in their graveyard as their fusion materials. But generally, Invoked decks will also play light monsters so they can go into this card. And they go into it very easily, so the fact that it has a great effect on top of its easy summoning condition is why it's definitely a meta card that sees lots of success. As what this card does is once per turn you can negate the effect of a card as long as you discard a card from your hand of the same type. So exactly like the counter trap card Ultimate Providence, except you also get to banish the card after you negate its effect, which is much better than destroying it. So if your opponent activates a monster card, for example, you would have to discard a monster from your hand to negate it, a spell card for a spell card, and so on and so on. And since this card is easy to get out, it just allows you to have another negate on the board, in order to help you set up a board full of monsters with negates, as that's kind of the meta game for a lot of decks, trying to get out as many monsters that have a negate as possible, so you can stop your opponent from playing the game. And at number 8, we have number S39, Utopia the Lightning. This is a rank 5 Xyz monster which can be brought out by simply ranking it on top of a rank 4 Utopia monster you control, and has the effect where, if this card battles, you can detach 2 of its materials to set its attack to 5,000 for that battle. And if this card declares an attack, your opponent can't activate any card effects until the end of the damage step. And basically, since this card can be brought out with any 2 level 4 monsters, if you just rank it up on top of Utopia or one of its other forms to give it more Xyz materials, this card basically gave any level 4 toolbox easy access to a 5,000 attack monster that could beat over basically anything, and really helped those toolboxes deal with problem cards like Towers or Ultimate Falcon. Ultimate Falcon can kind of win you games on its own because it's an immune monster with 3,500 attack, but Utopia the Lightning can just beat over it as long as you have 2 level 4 monsters, and the Utopia cards in your extra deck to go into it. Although it's not used as much today as it was in Master Rule 4, but it was still one of the few Xyz cards that consistently saw play during Master Rule 4 because it was just that good. And at number 7, we have Earthbound Immortal Asclepiscu. This card has the effect where, if it's sent from the field to the graveyard except by its own effect, you can destroy all of your opponent's monsters and then inflict 800 damage to your opponent for each monster they control. So if you simply combo this card with Black Garden and Union Carrier, it's possible to give your opponent 5 tokens during your first turn, with Oslepiscu equipped to one of your monsters, and then just send that monster to the graveyard in order to activate its effect from the spell and trap card zone, since it counts as being face up on the field, and being destroyed by something that's not its own effect. And since it's so easy to set up this combo for a whole bunch of different kinds of decks, all you have to do is get off this effect 2 times during your first turn and you can FTK your opponent. They can also be brought out with number 29 Mannequin Cat, targeting one of your opponent's Black Garden tokens, for basically the same effect. The effect is a little bit too easy to pull off, so don't be surprised if this card gets banned in the future. It also has another effect if you're not trying to cheese out an FTK, where it can attack directly and can't be attacked while on the field. But also it destroys itself if you don't have a face-up field spell card, so it actually is pretty useful on the field. A 2500 attack direct attacker who can't be targeted by attacks is pretty useful. Just not like something you'd build your deck around useful. That's kind of slow unless it does something else, and this card definitely does something else, which is why it makes it on this list. And at number 6, we have Eldritch, the Golden Lord. This card is the main combo piece of the Eldritch archetype, because basically all of their spell and trap cards require an Eldritch monster to be on the field in order to use their effects or gain extra effects, and there is only one Eldritch monster in the game. Luckily, the Eldritch monster is actually super good, and so good that it has a whole bunch of meta decks dedicated to it, or use it as an engine in order to supplement other decks. And what this card does is it has a hand and graveyard effect, where its hand effect allows you to get rid of cards on the field, by sending itself and one spell or trap card from your hand to the graveyard in order to target one card on the field and just send it to the graveyard, which is non-destruction removal. And its graveyard effect allows you to send a card in your spell and trap card zone to the graveyard in order to add this card back to your hand. Special summon a zombie type monster from your hand, and then give that monster 1000 attack and defense and make it so they can't be destroyed by card effects until the end of your opponent's next turn. And it definitely can choose itself. So it can come out and have 3500 attack and be destruction immune for a turn with its own effect. And I think that's kind of why it has 2500 attack, because it definitely intended to be brought out with its graveyard effect. So if it was the standard boss monster level of 3000 attack, that would have made it a 4000 attack beater that's immune to destruction, which is a little bit too much. But 3500 is a lot more reasonable. That's like Ultimate Falcon's levels of attack. And at number 5, we have True King Lithosagem, the Disaster. This card has a grand total of 3 effects. One of them is for how this card can be summoned, where you can destroy up to 2 other face-up monsters you control or in your hand, including at least 1 Earth monster. Then you get to special summon this card. Its second effect takes place if both of the monsters you chose to destroy were Earth attribute instead of just one of them, where you can then look at your opponent's extra deck and banish up to 3 monsters from it with different names. It was this effect that actually got the card banned for a while, because that's super good, as a lot of decks only play 1 copy of their main combo pieces in the extra deck, so you could kind of win the game with this effect alone against certain decks. And its last effect is a floating effect, where if this card is destroyed by card effect, you can special summon a non-Earth worm-type monster from your graveyard. Seeing as this card was mainly played in dinosaur decks, that floating effect didn't really come into play very much. Although dinosaurs love to destroy their own cards as they gain great benefits from it, especially cards like Baby Ceratosaurus, which is also Earth attribute, so it comboed a little bit too well in an already good deck, which is why the card is still currently limited to this day. It's no longer banned at the very least, but it's still super strong because of how extra deck reliant so many decks are. And at number 4, we have Block Dragon. This card has a floating effect that can allow you to go +2, which sounds super good, but it was only usable with a very unpopular type of monster. So for a long time it only saw niche play, until an actual good archetype with rock monsters came out, and then this card kind of shot up in usefulness, and is now considered a little bit broken. So depending when you're watching this video, it might already be banned, same with Oslepiscu. So Block Dragon, it can't be normal summoned or set, and can only be special summoned from your hand or graveyard by banishing 3 Earth monsters from your hand or graveyard. So its summoning condition can be activated from the graveyard, which makes this card even better. And then while it's on the field, it gives your rock type monsters some protection. That's not really why it's used. It's its next effect, where if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, that means you can activate its floating effect by just using it as a link material or something. You can then add up to 3 rock-type monsters from your deck to your hand, as long as their total levels equal exactly 8. And what do you know? The new meta archetype Adamantimators are all level 4 and 2, so it's very easy to get level 8 from searching those cards out, especially if you just throw a Doki Doki into the mix. So a card that is able to bring itself out easily and has an excellent conditions for its floating effect, which allows you to gain even more advantage off of it. It's really hard to find monsters that are better than Black Dragon for the 2500 attack range. And at number 3, we have Astrograph Sorcerer. This is a pendulum monster that is currently banned because it works a little bit too well with pendulum decks. You see, Astrograph Sorcerer has this effect that if a card you control is destroyed, you can special summon this card from your hand. Then you get to choose one monster in your graveyard, extra deck, or that is currently banished, which was destroyed this turn, and then you get to add one monster with the same name as that monster from your deck to your hand. This effect is not once per turn, and that's probably why it's banned, because let me tell you a little bit about pendulum decks to understand what's so good about that. You see, pendulum decks love to destroy their own monsters in their scales, because pendulum monsters go to the extra deck when they're destroyed on the field, and a lot of the best archetypes of the pendulum monsters gain effects when they're destroyed on the field in the same way, or just destroy themselves in order to do things. So for just playing a pendulum deck normally, you'll be able to fulfill the conditions of Astrograph Sorcerer to special summon itself from your hand and then go +1 off of that summon. It's kind of like if Elemental Hero Stratos had 700 more attack and could special summon itself from your hand. That's basically Astrograph Sorcerer. And Elemental Hero Stratos was banned for years because it's a card that can search from the deck without a once per turn restriction on its search effect. Just to give a little context on how powerful this is, and what a little bit of an oversight it was, and how incredibly easy it is to actually use the effect. If you have this card in your hand and you're playing a pendulum deck, you're going to go +1. If you have multiple copies in your hand, you're going to get even more pluses. In fact, there are some pendulum cards that allow you to add this card back to your hand from the extra deck, to allow you to go for even more cards. In fact, the only limiter to this card is that you might run out of targets to search out from the deck, because it does require you to have copies of that card you want to search out in your graveyard, banish zone, or extra deck face up. Now, the card also has some other effects, but those aren't why this card is good or banned. It can also banish a combination of cards to allow you to special summon Supreme King Zark from your extra deck, and its pendulum effect allows you to destroy it in order to special summon a Stargazer Magician from your deck, or set it as one of your pendulum scales. And at number 2, we have Beatrice, Lady of the Eternal. This is a rank 6 Xyz monster who can be brought out with any 2 level 6 monsters, or by ranking it up on top of a Dante monster by sending it a Burning Abyss monster from your hand to the graveyard. And then it has the effect where, on a quick effect, it can detach one of its materials to send any one card from your deck to the graveyard. And it also has a floating effect where if it's destroyed, you can special summon any Burning Abyss monster from your extra deck, ignoring its summoning condition. Now, the reason this card sees as much play as it does, and why it's limited to 1 on the ban list, is because of the effect to send any one card from your deck to the graveyard attached to an extra deck monster. You see, there are so many combos and strategies where you want a specific card in the graveyard, but that require you to get some kind of specific card from your deck in order to get that card in the graveyard, like Foolish Burial or Armageddon Knight, 2 cards that are also currently limited. There's a couple of cards on this list that are useful in the graveyard, like Black Dragon or Eldritch the Golden Lord, as a whole bunch of FTK decks or just indestructible combo boards are made much better if you're able to send one specific key combo piece from your deck to the graveyard. And since it's on an extra deck monster, that means you only need to get out 2 level 6 monsters in order to perform that specific mill, rather than searching out a specific card to perform a specific mill. One of them is much easier to do than the other. And that's also why Lavalval Chain is banned, since that card was even easier to bring out and can basically perform the same function. Being able to selectively mill a card from the deck is super powerful, even more so on cards with generic materials. The only reason Beatrice isn't also banned is because it's harder to bring out than Lavalval Chain, and it also just happens to have 2500 attack, which isn't super useful for the card. Then again, a lot of the cards in this list don't really care about their attack power value very much. It just happens to have 2500 attack, and just happens to have a very good effect in a whole bunch of combo decks. And at number 1, we have Firewall Dragon, one of the original Link monsters that came out, and is currently banned because they forgot to give it a once per turn on one of its effects. You see, once Link monsters first came out, they also came out with Master Rule 4, which severely limited how you could use previous extra deck monsters, and a lot of people were not happy about this new ruling. So they tried to make some of the first Link monsters very powerful in order to kind of compensate for not being able to do a whole bunch of past strategies. And Firewall Dragon was meant to be the poster boy of those kinds of cards. It was a Link 4 monster with very generous arrows, which meant it could be used as a starter or an extender. It required any 2+ monsters, so it could be brought out with nothing but tokens if you wanted. It had the ability to bounce cards in the field or return cards from the graveyard to your hand, equal to the number of cards it was culling to, on a quick effect. So it had a useful effect it could use immediately or during your opponent's turn to disrupt plays, since it could be used as a recovery tool or a way to push for game. And then it had one more little innocuous effect, that if a monster this card points to is sent to the graveyard, you can special summon one monster from your hand. This was supposed to make link climbing a lot easier, as you could just link summon with the monster this card pointed to in order to get another card out of your hand easier, and since it was only from your hand, you were kind of limited in the resources that you could special summon with the effect, as special summoning monsters from the hand is kind of the weakest place to special summon a monster from. If you were to make a tier list of the best places to special summon a monster from, with the hand, extra deck, graveyard, or bandage zone, the hand would be at the bottom of that list. But here's the thing about this effect. This is actually the broken part of the card because it's not once per turn. So if you simply found a way to loop a couple of cards, you could use something like Cannon Soldier in order to tribute that card that you were trying to loop in order to perform an FTK. One of the more famous examples was a Assault Core. It has an effect that allows you to add a Union monster from your graveyard to your hand when it's sent from the field to the graveyard. And it itself is a Union monster, so you could just loop 2 copies of them with Firewall Dragon and Cannon Soldier in order to burn your opponent for all their life points during your first turn. And it was very easy to set up, so what they did was limit a Assault Core rather than ban Firewall Dragon, because they wanted Firewall Dragon to be useful to all the other decks in order to allow the Link monsters to really help decks rather than limit them. However, people just kept finding ways to abuse its last effect, so eventually they relented and just banned the card, like they should have done from the very beginning. And it stayed banned because the effect is still super strong even today, and would be a lot more useful after the Master Rule revisions loosen the restrictions on extra deck summoning. So don't expect to see the card unbanned anytime soon, unless they slap a hard once per turn on that last effect. Alright, and that's the list. There are a ton of really good monsters at 2500 attack, so there's a good chance I might have missed something good. If you can think of any other better cards that should have made this list, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one. And also, if you like these scripted, highly edited videos on Yu-Gi-Oh! And maybe have a passing interest in D&D, then you might like my new channel, the D&D Logs, which basically has videos just like this but about Dungeons & Dragons, which will be linked in the video description and at the end of the video right now. The ability to special summon monsters kind of goes hand in hand with modern meta decks, so it's very rare for a card to not allow itself to be special summoned and to actually do something useful. So in this list we'll go over 10 of the best cards that cannot be special summoned. And at number 10 we have Yata-Garasu. This card is currently banned and was one of the first banned cards in the game's history, as it was part of the combo with Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End, and Sangan, where you could use Emperor Chaos Dragon to get rid of all cards in the field and in both players' hands. Then use Sangan's effect from the graveyard to add Yata-Garasu from your deck to your hand. Then simply summon Yata-Garasu and attack directly for 200 points of damage, which would lock them out of being able to draw a card, and basically win you the duel, as long as you continue to summon and peck every turn, as your opponent wouldn't be able to play any cards since Yata-Garasu had the effect where if it attacks directly your opponent skips their next draw phase. It also cannot be special summoned, and it returns to your hand during the end phase, so it seems incredibly weak on surface level, and it really is by itself, but it has the potential to just stop your opponent from being able to play the game, which used to be a big deal back in the day. Currently though, if they unbanned Yata-Garasu, I'm not even sure if it would see play. The ability to just have your opponent skip their draw phase isn't a super big deal anymore, and there's already better cards that try to stop your opponent from playing the game anyway, where the limitations on Yata-Garasu would be kind of too much in the modern metagame. Unless I'm missing something super secret broken combo, I'm sure Yatagarasu would be perfectly a-okay to be unmanned without an errata, and it's a wonder why it's still on the ban list in the first place, as the card has never come off the ban list ever since it was added over 15 years ago. And at number 9, we have Light and Darkness Dragon. This card cannot be special summoned and simply has the effect on the field that it's also treated as a dark attribute monster, which is just kind of flavor. The real benefit of this card and why it saw play in the past is because it kind of works like an Appaloosa Bow of the Goddess, but one with a mandatory effect that works on everything and not just monster cards. Once per chain, when a player activates a card effect, this card will try to negate that card effect and then lose exactly 500 attack and defense. So it also negates your own cards, since it's a mandatory effect. So you have to be careful when you use it. If this card is not able to fulfill the cost to reduce its attack and defense by 500 points, it can't activate its effect. Which means once it goes down to 800 attack, it kind of just stops working, since its defense would be at 400 as well, and you can't lower it by 500 points without going into negative numbers. In which case, you can just flip it face down in order to reset its attack points. It also has another effect that if it's destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you get to special summon one monster from your graveyard, but also destroy all other cards you control. So this card is really all or nothing. It negates everything but your stuff as well, and when it's destroyed it gets to special summon something, but not before it destroys all your stuff as well. And the card saw a lot of competitive play in old school Monarch decks before the new wave of Monarch spell and trap card support kind of changed how those decks play. Since Monarch decks used to kind of only use one monster per turn with a normal summon, and used a handful of hand traps in order to protect themselves, Light and Darkness Dragon could just negate everything your opponent tried to do, and then replace itself on death with another card that you could distribute on your next turn for a Monarch. You could also tribute your Light and Darkness Dragon with a Monarch in order to get rid of it yourself and continue your own plays. Although Light and Darkness Dragon saw the most amount of play in Dragon Ruler decks in 2013, since it itself was a dragon, and that deck was very monster effect heavy. The negates that Light and Darkness Dragon can leave on the field were pretty good, and they could tribute the card with one of their Dragon Rulers in the same way Monarchs could in order to get rid of it during their turn. And they also mainly played from the graveyard, so they didn't really care about having cards in the field destroyed with Light and Darkness Dragon's floating effect, and it was kind of a staple addition in full power Dragon Rulers. Although it doesn't really see play in modern day, the negate of Light and Darkness Dragon was always something you kind of had to play around. And with how many better negates there are in the game nowadays, you don't really need to bother with the maintenance of Light and Darkness Dragon anymore. And at number 8, we have Apocryphort Towers. This card has the effect where it cannot be special summoned and requires 3 tributes for its tribute summon, specifically 3 Klee monsters. And while this card is on the field, it's unaffected by all spell and trap cards and the effects of monsters who have a lower level/rank than this card's current level, which is always level 10. It also passively lowers the attack of all special summoned monsters by 500, and has a once per turn effect where you can force your opponent to send one monster from their hand or their side of the field to the graveyard. This effect does not target and actually gets past a lot of immunity since it's forcing your opponent to perform an action instead of actually affecting a monster. So it's one of the few ways to get rid of an immune monster like Ultimate Falcon, or another copy of Apocryphort Towers. And this card used to be incredibly oppressive when it first came out, as the Qliphort archetype was able to get out as tribute fodder very easily, and some of their cards even had extra effects when they were tributed. So you could just kind of gain advantage while bringing towers out, while also being able to search out towers super easily, and it was almost impossible for your opponent to actually get rid of the card once it was out. Towers came out before the Kaijus did, so it was almost an unbeatable boss monster that people thought was unfair, which is why the card got banned eventually, and stayed banned until Link monsters came out and made its protection almost worthless. Because the card was, for all intents and purposes, immune to card effects, unless a monster happened to have a level or rank of 10 or higher, which a lot of decks did not have, or could get a monster with more than 3,500 attack on the field, since it lowered the attack of all special summoned monsters. One of the more popular ways to get rid of towers was to use a lesser known Xyz monster called number 52 Diamond Crab King, since it had this unique effect where it had 0 attack baseline and you could detach one of its materials in order to change its attack to 3,000 for the turn. And because of the unique way this card gained attack points, it technically went under the effect of towers and wasn't decreased to 2,500. So at best, Diamond Crab King could beat over Apocryphort Towers by just suiciding into it. So even the popular out to the card required you to lose advantage in order to do it. But since Link monsters don't have levels or ranks, they completely ignore Tower's immunity and you get rid of it no problem with one little unicorn boy, which is why the card doesn't really see play even though it got unbanned years ago. And at number 7, we have Card D. This card cannot be special summoned and has the effect that during your main phase 1, during the turn in which this card was normal summoned, you can tribute this card in order to draw 2 cards. Then it has additional side effects where it immediately becomes your end phase, and you also cannot special summon during the turn you activate its effect. So the card is kind of super restrictive in everything it does. It can't be special summoned, it requires you to use the effect during the turn it brings itself out, it doesn't let you special summon anything else, and then immediately just ends your turn. But it lets you draw 2 cards, so it definitely saw play, and still occasionally sees niche play because that's really good. The ability to draw 2 cards is just so good that a lot of players are willing to put up with all kinds of restrictions in order to do it. Just look at Pot of Desires or Pot of Extravagance. They require you to banish a crazy number of cards from your deck or extra deck in order to use their effects, and they both see all kinds of competitive play because drawing 2 cards is just that valuable. Card D isn't as versatile in decks that can be used as those 2 pot cards, but in the decks which don't mind giving up the normal summon or special summoning other monsters, they definitely play this card for the card advantage, like all kinds of burn or stall decks. Mainly Chain Burn, Mystic Mine, and Final Countdown decks like to take advantage of Card D. All a bunch of decks that are very infamous in the Yu-Gi-Oh community. So if you see someone use a Card D, that's a pretty good sign that you're about to play against an annoying deck. And at number 6, we have a Mono Iwato. This card cannot be special summoned and returns to your hand during the end phase of the turn that it's normal summoned or flip face up, and has the effect that while it's on the field, monsters cannot activate their effects. So it's a full lockdown similar to Mystic Mine, and Mystic Mine is one of the most played field spell cards in the game. The ability to lock out all monster effects basically means you can summon this card and not worry about your opponent's hand trap for the rest of the turn. However, you can't use your other monster effects either, which isn't a big deal if you're playing a deck that's all about their spell and traps anyway. So this card occasionally saw play in decks like Sky Striker, True Draco, or even Mystic Mine decks, as it was an additional way to use your normal summon in order to lock down your opponent for a turn. You see, if you could just negate the effects of a Mono Iwato during the end phase, you could prevent its effect from returning itself to your hand in order to keep it during your opponent's turn, where it's much more useful than bringing it out during your turn. The card has a very strong effect, but it's supposed to be balanced around the fact that it can only be on the field for a limited amount of time anyway, and uses up your precious normal summon in order to do it. But if you just use a card like Forbidden Chalice on it during the end phase, then you can get to keep it, and your opponent will need to get out a monster with more than 1900 attack without being able to use monster effects. And with how monster effect heavy a lot of combo decks are, that can be kind of hard to accomplish for a lot of meta decks. And at number 5, we have Majesty's Fiend. This card cannot be special summoned and simply has the effect on the field where neither player can activate monster effects. So it's just like a Mono Iwato, except it doesn't return itself to the hand during the end phase. But it does require a tribute summon in order to bring it out, so it's a slightly harder to use on Mono Iwato, but there is a lot of decks that can provide the tribute fodder pretty easily, and also don't really use their monster effects. So Majesty's Fiend sees more play than a Mono Iwato in decks that specifically want to stop their opponent from using monster effects. Decks like Gren Maju, where their boss monster technically doesn't activate its effect and gains a whole bunch of attack. And they also play a whole bunch of danger monsters which provide easy tribute fodder. And at number 4, we have Vanity's Fiend. This card is just like Majesty's Fiend, except it prevents both players from special summoning monsters. Now, locking out special summons is stronger than logging out monster effects, so Vanity's Fiend sees slightly more play than Majesty's Fiends in basically the same kinds of decks. But funny enough, it's not played alongside Majesty's Fiend. Generally, decks that use Vanity's Fiends will choose to use either or, but rarely both. There's also a card called Vanity's Ruler, which is just like Vanity's Fiend except it requires one more tribute summon, and the card only prevents your opponent from special summoning monsters, which makes its effect strictly better, but since it requires one more tribute, that's kind of a little bit too much for it to be used as much as the other two cards. Even then, it did occasionally see play anyway, surprisingly in Necros decks, but Vanity's Fiend and Majesty's Fiend are kind of played more since they're easier to bring out, as long as the decks they're in are playing around their side effects. And at number 3, we have Denko Sekka. This card cannot be special summoned, and it has the effect on the field that while you control no set spell or trap cards, neither player can set spell or trap cards, nor activate the effects of spell or trap cards that are already set on the field. And since this card only requires your normal summon without any kind of tribute, Denko Sekka sees a lot of play in decks that want to shut down back row. This one card kind of just completely shuts down some decks while not really hindering the deck that's playing it very much. A lot of decks don't really use trap cards or other cards that are set face down, so they wouldn't really care about not being able to set cards, as they can still activate cards face up on the field. Denko Sekka enjoys lots of success as a side deck addition, and has kinda seen competitive play ever since it first came out in 2014, and is easily the second most played card on this list of all time. And at number 2, we have the Tyrant Neptune. This card cannot be special summoned, and you can choose to tribute summon this card with only one monster if you want. It has the effect where it gains the total original attack and defense of all of the monsters used for its tribute summon, and then it's able to choose one of the monsters used for its summon in the graveyard in order to copy its effect permanently, and change its name to that card's name. This card was kind of a joke card for a long time, and never saw any competitive success in the TCG. But once they released Lyrilisk Independent Nightingale in the OCG, the card kind of became crazy broken overnight, as it could tribute the card in order to gain that card's effect of being immune to all card effects, inflicting 5,000 points of damage to your opponent once per turn, and just passively having 6,000 attack. So the card got banned in the TCG before they ever released Lyrilisk Independent Nightingale, and will probably stay banned even if they do ban that one fusion monster, because the potential for abuse of copying other graveyard effects is just too strong for the card to really exist in the game. And at number 1, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra, Sphere Mode. This card cannot be special summoned, but it can be normal summoned to your opponent's side of the field if you tribute 3 of their monsters. And the ability to tribute your opponent's monsters to bring this card out, which can't be stopped, makes Sphere Mode one of the best forms of removal in the game, as there are a lot of immune boss monsters, or boss monsters that just have negates, which are usually very hard to get rid of with other forms of removal, like say a Raigeki. When Sphere Mode just kind of ignores all of that, your opponent can't really stop it from happening other than preventing you from normal or tribute summoning at all, which very few non-ban cards can even do. The Winged Dragon Raw Sphere Mode is currently the most played card on this list, and is included in a whole bunch of competitive side decks. Way more than Denko Sekka, who is also very heavily played, I might add. Sphere Mode is just kind of better. And it's funny that the reason it's so good is not the reason the card was created. It was made as a way to allow you to cheat out the Winged Dragon of Ra easier, but no one even uses that card with Sphere Mode because it's kind of not the point of the card. They only care about its summoning condition to tribute 3 of their opponent's monsters, not the actual effect of special summoning the Winged Dragon of Ra from your deck and setting its attack and defense to 4,000. Alright, and that's the list. There aren't a lot of monsters that can't be special summoned in the game, so it was a surprisingly very narrow list to choose monsters from. Even so, if you think I missed some better cards that should have definitely been on this list, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And also, did you know I have a new Go to Sleep playlist, which has all of my highly edited videos on it, which is surprisingly one of my most viewed playlists on the channel, even though it's kinda new. Link to the playlist will be at the end of the video right now. In this video, we'll be going over the best cards that have an effect that allow them to special summon themselves from the hand, even if they can also special summon themselves from somewhere else. And at number 10, we have Spiral Super Agent. This card has the effect where you can declare one card type and then look at the top card of your opponent's deck. And if you guessed correctly that it was a monster, spell, or trap card, you get to special summon this card from your hand. And then it goes on to have another effect where, if this card is special summoned by the effect of a spiral card, you get to destroy one of your opponent's spell or trap cards. And since itself is a spiral card, if you manage to successfully special summon this card from your hand, you get to destroy one of your opponent's spell or trap cards. And wouldn't you know it, this card is basically the main piece of the Spiral engine, as most of the Spiral deck revolves around this card or needs it in order to use their effects. And the card this entire deck revolves around happens to be pretty good on its own. It has high stats as a level 4 monster, it can bring itself out of the hand very easily, and gets to pop a card when it comes out. The Spiral archetype easily allows you to look at cards at the top of your opponent's deck, so you should be able to guess it correctly every time you use its effect, or at least know what your opponent has for the next Spiral card you use, as a lot of them have similar effects of looking at the top card of your opponent's deck. And Spiral Super Agent was part of one of the very few tier 0 decks in the game's history, and the fact that it could special summon itself from the hand so easily definitely helped contribute to that deck's massive success. To know how much of a big deal that is, there are hundreds of archetypes in the game, and less than 10 tier 0 decks in the game's entire history. Although this card is more of a combo piece, and it isn't super good outside of its deck. In this video, we'll be going over the best cards and effects that can only be activated when your opponent declares a direct attack. So, kind of a limited selection of cards, which means I get to talk about a lot of lesser known cards, which is my favorite thing to do. And at number 10, we have Dimension Gate. This is a continuous trap card which has the effect that allows you to banish one monster you control. Then when this card is sent to the graveyard, you can special summon the monster banished with this card's effect. And also when your opponent declares a direct attack, you can send this card to the graveyard. So that's where its direct attack effect comes in. Technically it has 3 effects. The main purpose of this card is to remove one of your monsters from the field in order to bring it back later. And you can bring it back immediately upon your opponent declaring a direct attack, which means the card has a failsafe put into it, so that you can bring the monster back to protect yourself if you're being attacked directly. It kind of functions in a more controlled way as Interdimensional Matter Transporter, a card that simply allows you to banish a card you control until the end phase. And the reason you'd want to use cards like this is because you can chain them in response to any form of removal in order to allow them to basically dodge the effect. It's kind of the perfect counter to a lot of things, unless your opponent is using spell speed for removal, in which case you can't respond to it. Although it's kind of limited in which cards it's good with, as there are some monsters that don't want to leave the field because they only have effects that are live when they're brought out in a certain way. Or like Xyz monsters who will lose all of their Xyz materials if they're banished temporarily. However, there are some monsters where this is actually a benefit. Cards like Beast King Barbaros, who could normal summon themselves at 1900 attack instead of their original 3000, without a tribute summon, would be absolutely fine getting banished and returning because then it would come back with its full 3000 attack. Or cards like the Windups who can only use their effects a single time on the field. Dimension Gate could allow them to reset that use. While the card never did see any play in the TCG, it did actually see a lot of play over in Duel Links for resetting the attacks of monsters who bring themselves out with lower attack, and providing cards to destroy with Storm in order to get rid of their opponent's back row, since it was used in the early days of the game when back row clear was still pretty hard to come by. And since if you destroyed your own card, all it did was bring your monster back, so there wasn't really a negative side effect to it, and it actually comboed very well with Storm decks. It allowed you to provide one of the materials needed for Storm to destroy cards, while also allowing some protection on your monsters. And at number 9, we have Countergate. This card can only be activated when your opponent declares a direct attack, in which case you get to negate the attack, draw one card, and then if it was a monster, you can normal summon it in face-up attack position. Now, this card actually provides some nice advantage if you're able to pull it off. You get to simultaneously deny one of your opponent's attacks, and replace that card you used to do that, making the card completely card neutral and card advantage, while also providing a positive effect on top of it, and even has the niche use of allowing you to normal summon during your opponent's turn, which could be used to bring out a spirit monster, since those cards normally can't be special summoned, or to even tribute summon a monarch during your opponent's battle phase if you found a way to also chain a way to get a monster on the field for that tribute, so that it can get rid of some of your opponent's cards. Not really something that's going to happen, but technically is something you can do. Or even if you don't apply the normal summon effect, being able to draw cards while negating an attack is still pretty nice. The card never actually saw play in normal TCG. It came out way too late when these kinds of effects weren't really good, especially when you can just use a Mirror Force card to destroy all of your opponent's monsters instead. But in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, this card enjoys a healthy amount of success, because it's pretty easy to get for free-to-play players and has those benefits I mentioned earlier. And being able to negate one attack is much more valuable in Duel Links than it is in normal Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of the smaller monster card zones. Although it still has the disadvantage of the activation requirement. One of the reasons battle traps don't see play in the normal TCG is because they're sitting ducks for destruction effects, and they usually get destroyed before they ever get a chance to do anything, which is kind of the same thing in Duel Links as well. And there are even better battle traps in that game than Countergate, but it's still a pretty nice option for free-to-play players if they don't have the availability of the better battle traps like Wall of Disruption, or if they want to play it alongside them for the advantage and benefits it gives. Now, for videos like these where the cards aren't exactly meta in the TCG, I might be talking about Duel Links a lot, so just a heads up on that. And at number 8, we have Swordsman of Revealing Light. This is a level 8 monster who has an effect in the hand that can only be activated when your opponent declares a direct attack, in which case you get to special summon this card from your hand, and then if the monster who attacked has an attack which is lower than this card's defense of 2400, then you get to also destroy the attacking monster. It is important to note that this card does not negate the attack, it simply allows you to special summon itself and then maybe destroy the card if it has less than 2400 attack. Which means if you're using it to stop a big boss monster from attacking, the best you can do is put a body on the field so that they'll have to attack over it instead. But if you use it to stop a smaller monster, then it's pure advantage, being able to bring the card out and destroy a monster in the process. The card also has an additional effect if it's used as an Xyz material, where it grants the Xyz monster the effect that the first time it would be destroyed by battle each turn, it's not destroyed, which is actually pretty good protection, but not something you want to go out of your way to grant a monster. But it's still pretty good nonetheless. Although generally, rank 8 Xyz monsters have a high attack, and they're not being destroyed by battle anyway. It would be a lot better if it also provided destruction protection from effects as well. Swordsman of Revealing Light never really saw any competitive play, although it is better than the first two options, as it provides better protection and has the benefit of a card that can stay in your hand in order to activate its effect, rather than being vulnerable on the field like Countergate. So it's much harder to counterplay against Swordsman of Revealing Light, even though it technically only stops one attack as well, and only has the option to maybe destroy something by card effect. It's also currently not in Duel Links, but would probably see play if it was ever added to it. And at number 7, we have Dances with Beasts. This is another battle trap like Countergate, which can only be activated if your opponent declares a direct attack. And also, while the combined attack of all face-up monsters your opponent controls is 8,000 or higher, i.e. enough to finish you off with your starting life points of 8,000. Then, under these two specific conditions, you get to special summon 3 monsters with different original names to your side of the field in attack position, one from your hand, deck, and graveyard. So the conditions to activate this are a little bit cumbersome, but not unreasonable. It's actually pretty easy for the average meta deck to get a full field of monsters with more than 8,000 attack combined, although it's a little bit harder for that game state to also allow your trap cards to still be on the field by the time they enter the battle phase. But assuming they do enter the battle phase without destroying this card, or without a negate to just stop it, being able to special summon 3 monsters at once is really good, especially since 2 of them come from excellent targets, your deck, and graveyard. Being able to special summon a monster from your deck is one of the best effects in the game, and this card allows you to pick any target, just as long as it has a different name from the other two targets. Because Dances with Beasts exists, it kind of creates one extra card that allows you to selectively search out any card in the game, which would probably muddy up some of those tip pages on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Wikis about cards allowed to search out specific monsters. It also allows you to bring out a monster from the graveyard, which isn't that big of a deal on a trap card, and is more valuable if it's something you're able to do during your turn without setup. But in addition to the other two, its special summon is pretty nice as well. If one of the targets you bring out is Thunderclap Skywolf, you can just wipe out all of your opponent's monsters with the effect. Or at the very least, put 3 monsters in the field with floating effects to allow you to gain more advantage or something. It's not the best card in the world, to be honest, but then again, people don't really play battle traps in the TCG anyway, unless they provide ridiculous benefits, and also fit into a deck that can use them or protect them in some way. Dances with Beasts does kind of provide ridiculous benefits. That's why it also has the extra restriction of your opponent controlling monsters with more than 8,000 attack combined, to try to make it less appealing, and to still kind of make it not half bad. The card probably would have seen more play if it was released a little bit earlier on in Yu-Gi-Oh's life, but since it came out in 2019, where no one really uses battle traps anymore outside of very specific decks that don't really use monsters, it doesn't really see any play. And at number 6, we have Speedroid Menko. This is a monster with a hand effect that can only be activated when your opponent declares a direct attack, where you can special summon this card in attack position, and then change all face-up monsters your opponent controls to defense position. So basically it allows you to block out an entire battle phase, which is really good for certain stall decks that don't like to play trap cards on the field where they're vulnerable to being destroyed. It's a lot harder to stop a hand effect that stops the battle phase than it is to stop a trap card that stops the battle phase. So Speedroid Menko absolutely saw competitive play all the way up until 2017. And the reason the card stopped seeing play in 2017 is because that's the year in which Link monsters were introduced to the game. Link monsters are a really powerful type of extra deck monster, which all have this little caveat to them, where none of them can exist in defense position. So they're just straight up immune to any effects which change their battle positions. And since the way Speedroid Menko was meant to stop the battle phase was by flipping all those monsters to defense position, so that they can't attack anymore, it just doesn't work on Link monsters. So they can beat over this card no problem, since it has to come out in attack position with its 100 attack points. So until Link monsters came out, it was really good. But now, not so much. It's just an inferior version of other cards I'll talk about later on in this list. And we'll probably only see play again if it's released in Duel Links, since cards like Sphere Karibo see play in that game, and they only stop one monster by changing it to defense position. And at number 5, we have Rainbow Karibo. This is a level 1 monster who has 2 effects. One of them allows you to equip this card from your hand to an opponent's monster that declares an attack, which then stops that monster from attacking permanently. Then it has a graveyard effect, that if an opponent's monster declares a direct attack while this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon the card, but it's banished when it leaves the field. So both of these effects are pretty good. The ability to stop a monster from attacking from the hand is actually pretty decent, especially since the stop lasts for as long as this card is equipped to the monster. It's kind of like Fiendish Chain, minus the effect negation. Then in the graveyard, you can just use this card to block one attack, which is generally a pretty good thing, even if it's only once per turn. And the reason this card saw play in the past was mainly because it's a light attribute monster. If you happen to have a card in your hand, you gain the double benefit from both of its effects to attach itself to a monster, and then later use it to block one attack with its body. However, if you're able to send it directly from your deck to the graveyard, then it's just pure advantage with its ability to bring it out and stop an attack. That's why this card was sometimes used as a target for Shadow decks who need a light monster in order to bring out El Shadow Construct. It even saw play in Lightsworn Dragon Ruler decks when they were still legal. Although modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't really about stopping singular attacks, unless stopping that singular attack also grants you some other kind of benefit. And if it were, then Rainbow Karibo would see a lot more play, because it's a really good stopper from the hand. Although the modern metagame is more about destroying everything before entering the battle phase, or negating your opponent before they build a board, and not really preventing a couple of attacks with one monster. And at number 4, we have Swift Scarecrow. This is a monster that has the effect in the hand where if your opponent declares a direct attack, you can discard this card in order to end the battle phase. Now, since this card stops an entire battle phase from the hand, it's actually really good and saw lots of competitive play in the past for any deck that wanted to stall out for whatever their strategy was using. It even saw play in a couple of machine decks that could make use of its type and attribute in the hand or graveyard, which also had the niche benefit of protecting them for a turn if they happened to get behind in the game state. But normally, Swift Scarecrow was only used in stall decks like Final Countdown, and also in a lot of Cleafort and Burning Abyss decks, surprisingly enough. But only as a side deck one of. Basically, those two decks had so much recursion that if they could just survive one extra turn, they could completely build their whole board again. So it makes sense for them to maybe want to stall out against certain decks. The card doesn't really see play anymore, because even being able to stop a full battle phase isn't really enough for a card to see play in the metagame, because they don't really care about blocking out a battle phase unless it also grants them another benefit. And pure stall decks kind of transitioned into Mystic Mind variants, which don't really use monster effects at all, and don't really need to stop the battle phase. So, if they ever release a new super overpowered floodgate that does allow the player to use its monster effects and needs to stop the battle phase, then Scarecrow might show up in the meta again, with its last meta appearance being in a Reversal Quiz OTK deck in 2019. And at number 3, we have Ghost Trick Jack Frost. This is a level 1 monster, which has an effect if your opponent declares a direct attack, where you can change the opponent's monster to face down defense position, and then special summon this card from your hand in face down defense position. So realistically, it only blocks one attack, and then allows you to special summon a monster who can potentially be used to block another attack with its defense position body. So at best, you get a 2-for-1 block with this card. So how does something like this make it higher on the list than Swift Scarecrow, a card that can block an entire battle phase from the hand? Well, Jack Frost's effect to flip a card face down technically does not target. So back in 2018 when Spirals were making a resurgence, a whole bunch of Spiral decks were running copies of Ghost Trick Jack Frost in their side deck in order to have an out to an enemy Spiral Sleeper, which under normal Spiral setups was a card that couldn't be targeted or destroyed by card effects, thanks to the effect of Spiral Gear Last Resort, which was usually equipped to him. And also, Spiral Sleeper could destroy 2 of your cards during your turn with its Spell Speed 2 Destruction. So it was kind of hard to out since it couldn't be targeted or destroyed by anything. That is, unless you flipped it face down with a Ghost Trick Jack Frost on its attack. While face down, it no longer had any of those immunities and couldn't disrupt your plays, since it needed to be face up to use its Spell Speed 2 Destruction. So it was actually kind of useful in that incredibly specific mirror match. Although as soon as Spirals got another hit on the ban list with them getting rid of a couple of the Nightmare Link monsters, it immediately failed to play in the meta, and hadn't actually seen any play till 4 years earlier in a couple of variants of just Ghost Trick decks. Ghost Trick Jack Frost is an excellent example of a card who blocks attacks that can see play in the modern meta, because it does something else besides block the attack, an effect of flipping a card face down. Although since its effect cannot apply to Link monsters and isn't super useful against other indestructible boss monsters who can just negate its effect nowadays, it promptly stopped seeing play in 2018. Although it was kind of funny how much play it did see in that year, and only in Spiral decks. I assume part of the reason it only saw play in those decks is because they already played the cards that accommodated level 1 monsters anyway, so they could then make use of Jack Frost later on. And at number 2, we have Drowning Mirror Force. This is the only Mirror Force card that can be activated when your opponent declares a direct attack, rather than all the other ones that can be activated when your opponent just declares any old normal attack. And because of its slightly harsher restriction, Drowning Mirror Force by far has the best effect of all the Mirror Force cards, where it returns all of your opponent's face-up attack position monsters back to the deck. Returning a monster to the deck is one of the best forms of removal in the game, because destroying or banishing cards doesn't actually hinder a lot of decks very much, whereas there's almost no deck that can gain advantage from having their cards returned to the deck. And funny enough, because of this card's slightly harsher restrictions on activation, it was the first good Mirror Force card added to Duel Links, besides Radiant Mirror Force, which no one uses because it's even bad in that game. And Drowning Mirror Force is good in normal Yu-Gi-Oh!, so obviously it sees play in Duel Links as well, and has kind of consistently seen play ever since it came out, to the point where some people won't attack directly if there's any face-down cards on the field in Duel Links, because they're so afraid of Drowning Mirror Force. In normal Yu-Gi-Oh! As well, Drowning Mirror Force has kinda seen consistent play ever since it came out, only run out of steam in 2020, as there have just been less and less decks that can accommodate battle traps in the metagame, although there just also have been less records on meta cards in 2020, for a different reason. So once we have more reliable data again, it's pretty safe to assume that the card will keep seeing play like it always has. And at number 1, we have Battle Fader. This card is exactly like Swift Scarecrow, with even the same stats and level, except it has one little benefit over Swift Scarecrow, where if your opponent declares a direct attack, you can special summon this card from your hand, and then end the battle phase. but if this card is special summoned this way, it banishes itself when it leaves the field. So you still get to end an entire battle phase with one card from your hand, which, as I've established with Scarecrow, is pretty good. However, you also get a level 1 monster on the field in the process. And because of this, Battle Fader has kind of seen play ever since it came out, in a whole variety of decks that aren't just stall ones like Swift Scarecrow. Because being able to stop the battle phase and then have a monster on the field for your next turn is pretty good in a whole bunch of situations. In past Monarch decks, it was a good way to stop the battle phase and then have a monster on the field as tribute fodder for more Monarchs. So it was softly considered a Monarch card because it was so synonymous with those decks, before Monarchs got their modern support, which kind of moved them to a more spell and trap card heavy focus, rather than the original, very light spell and trap card variants that existed in the past. In addition to the fact that it was just good in burn decks and install decks alongside Swift Scarecrow, because it basically gave you 2 cards to stop battle phases from the hand, which is made even better when Speedroid Menko came out and you had 3 cards that could stop the battle phase with 1 card from the hand, before Link Monsters came out and kind of ruined Speedroid Menko from being mentioned alongside Swift Scarecrow and Battle Fader. Swift Scarecrow and Battle Fader are not always played alongside each other. Battle Fader was actually played more in other decks because of its ability to special summon itself, which actually continues to the modern day. It currently occasionally sees play in anti-meta decks, including Grenmaju variants and even a random card trooper deck in 2020. So because Battle Fader actually continues to see play in the modern day, and has basically consistently seen play ever since it came out in 2010, and would be complete completely overpowered if it was ported over to Duel Links, it barely edges out Drowning Mirror Force as the best card, which can only be activated when your opponent declares a direct attack. Being able to gain advantage while also negating an entire battle phase without having to set a card in the field is kind of good. It's like Counter Gate on steroids. Alright, and that's the list. This video was actually requested on my Patreon from one of the higher tier rewards who get to pick video ideas, although most of the video ideas I do are done from comments and videos. So, if you know any other better cards that should have made this list, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And also, did you know I have a World of Warcraft channel with over 250,000 subscribers, and only 35.4% of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed to this channel. If everyone who watches these Yu-Gi-Oh videos was also subscribed, we could easily blow past the number of my World of Warcraft channel in like a month. In this video, we're going to go over card evolutions that are essentially better versions of their normal